Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stepped out of her dusty pickup truck at the Riverside shooting range. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the gravel parking lot, and the familiar scent of gunpowder and hot metal filled the air. She grabbed her worn rifle case from the truck bed, its leather handle smooth from years of use. At 28, Sarah looked nothing like what most people expected from someone with her background. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with shoulder-length brown hair, usually tied back in a simple ponytail, she could easily blend into any crowd. Her jeans and faded t-shirt gave no hint of the specialized training that had made her one of the most lethal snipers in military history. The shooting range buzzed with weekend activity. Families taught their children basic firearm safety, competitive shooters practiced for upcoming tournaments, and hunting enthusiasts zeroed their rifles for the upcoming season. Sarah walked quietly toward the long-range section, her soft-soled boots making barely a sound on the concrete walkway. Well, what do we have here?" The voice belonged to Marcus Thompson, a large man in his 40s who practically lived at the range on weekends. His expensive tactical gear and custom rifle screamed serious money, but his shooting skills had always been average at best. "Little lady, you sure you're in the right section? The beginner courses are over by the pistol range." Sarah paused, setting down her case. She had encountered this attitude countless times since returning to civilian life 6 months ago. People saw a petite woman and immediately assumed she had wandered into the wrong place. "I'm exactly where I need to be, thank you," Marcus chuckled, adjusting his oversized tactical vest. His buddies, 3 other middle-aged men who treated the shooting range like their personal club, gathered around with knowing smirks. "Listen, sweetheart, this isn't some hobby shooting. We're talking precision work at 800 yards. Takes years of training and natural talent that, well," he gestured vaguely at her small frame. "What Marcus is trying to say," interrupted his friend Dale, a stocky man with graying temples, "is that this kind of shooting requires serious upper body strength. The rifle alone weighs 15 pounds, and that's before you add the bipod and scope. Maybe you should start with something more manageable." Sarah remained calm, though she could feel the familiar tension building in her shoulders. These men had no idea they were talking to someone who had made confirmed kills at distances exceeding 1,200 yards in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. Her military service had taught her patience, but civilian life was testing those limits daily. "I appreciate the concern," Sarah said evenly, "but I can handle myself just fine." The third man, Kevin, laughed outright. "Handle yourself? Lady, do you even know what MOA means? Can you calculate wind drift at distance? This isn't point and shoot like in the movies." Marcus stepped closer, his voice taking on a condescending tone that made Sarah's jaw tighten. "Tell you what, since you seem determined to embarrass yourself anyway, why don't we make this interesting? There's a competition shoot next weekend. $500 entry fee, winner takes all. You game for that, or would you prefer to start with something more your speed?" The fourth member of their group, a thin man named Ray, snorted with amusement. "Marcus, that's not fair. She probably doesn't even own a proper rifle. That case looks like it came from a pawn shop." Sarah's rifle case was indeed well-worn, but what they couldn't see was the precision instrument nestled inside. Her Remington 700 had been customized by military armorers to exact specifications, with a barrel that had been hand-lapped and a trigger system that broke clean at exactly 2 pounds. The scope mounted on top cost more than most people's cars. "The competition sounds interesting," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the growing irritation. "What are the rules?" Marcus grinned, sensing what he believed would be easy money. "Standard precision shooting. Targets at 300, 500, and 800 yards. Best aggregate score wins. But since you're new here, maybe we should add a little twist to make it educational." He paused dramatically, enjoying the attention from other shooters who had begun to gather around. "How about this? If you can hit the 800-yard target just once during practice today, we'll waive your entry fee for next weekend. But when you miss, you have to admit that maybe long-range shooting isn't for everyone, especially—" He let the sentence hang in the air. The crowd that had gathered was now openly staring. Sarah could see the mixture of curiosity and skepticism in their faces. A few women in the group looked sympathetic, while the men seemed to be waiting for entertainment. She recognized the type of challenge this represented. It wasn't really about shooting. It was about putting her in what these men considered her proper place. "And if I hit the target?" Sarah asked quietly. Marcus laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "If you hit an 800-yard target on your first try? Hell, I'll personally apologize and buy your ammunition for a year. But that's not going to happen." Dale nodded agreement. The wind conditions alone make it nearly impossible for someone without serious experience. We've been shooting here for 15 years combined, and hitting that distance consistently took us months to master. Sarah looked toward the distant target range. 800 yards was certainly respectable for civilian shooting, though it seemed almost insultingly short compared to some of the shots she had made in Afghanistan. The wind was moderate, maybe 5 to 8 miles per hour from the east. Temperature looked to be around 95 degrees, with humidity that would affect the bullet's flight path minimally. "You're on," she said simply. The crowd murmured with interest as Sarah knelt down and opened her case. The rifle that emerged drew immediate attention. While it appeared to be a standard hunting rifle at first glance, closer inspection revealed the subtle modifications that marked it as something special. The barrel was heavier than standard. The stock had been precisely fitted, and the scope was a piece of precision engineering that cost more than many cars. Marcus's confident expression faltered slightly as he took in the quality of Sarah's equipment. That's a nice rifle," he admitted grudgingly. "Custom work?" "Something like that," Sarah replied, running her hands along the familiar curves of the weapon. This rifle had been with her through 2 combat deployments, carefully maintained and precisely zeroed. She knew its capabilities better than she knew her own reflection. Ray stepped forward, his earlier mockery replaced by genuine curiosity. "Where did you get training on something like that? That scope setup isn't exactly standard hunting gear." Sarah began the familiar ritual of preparing her weapon, checking the scope mounts and verifying the bolt action moved smoothly. "I picked up a few things here and there," she answered vaguely. The truth was that her training had come at the U.S. Army Sniper School, where she had graduated second in her class of 43 students, the highest-ranking woman in the program's history. Marcus regained some of his swagger as he watched her preparations. "Well, fancy equipment can't replace experience. You can buy the best gear in the world, but if you don't know how to use it properly, you're just throwing money away." The range officer, an elderly man named Joe, who had been watching the exchange with growing interest, approached the group. "What's all the commotion about over here?" "Just a friendly little challenge, Joe," Marcus explained with a grin. "Our new friend here thinks she can hit the 800-yard target. We're just trying to save her some embarrassment." Joe looked at Sarah with weathered eyes that had seen decades of shooters come and go. Something in her calm demeanor and professional weapon handling caught his attention. "You sure about this, miss? 800 yards is no joke, even for experienced shooters." Sarah looked up from her rifle, meeting the old man's gaze directly. "I'm sure," Joe nodded slowly. "All right then. Range is clear for long-distance shooting. Winds running about 6 miles per hour from the east, temperatures 96 degrees. Humidity's running around 60%. He paused, studying Sarah's face for any sign of uncertainty. "You get one shot to prove whatever point you're trying to make." The crowd had grown larger now, with nearly 20 people gathering to watch the spectacle. Word had spread quickly through the range that someone was attempting a challenging long-distance shot, and shooters love to see precision work, whether successful or not. Sarah settled into position behind her rifle, adjusting the bipod legs to account for the slight slope in the concrete. The familiar weight of the weapon felt like coming home. She pressed her cheek against the stock, finding the perfect spot where her eye aligned naturally with the scope. Through the high-powered optics, the 800-yard target came into sharp focus. It was a standard bullseye design, black circles on white paper, with a scoring system that demanded precision. The center ring was barely larger than a silver dollar when viewed from this distance. Marcus couldn't resist one final comment. "Remember, it's not just about pointing and shooting. You have to account for bullet drop, wind drift, even the rotation of the earth at this distance. Takes years to develop that kind of instinct." Sarah ignored him, focusing instead on reading the environmental conditions. The wind had shifted slightly, now coming more from the southeast at maybe 7 miles per hour. The temperature hadn't changed significantly, but the humidity seemed to be increasing as the afternoon progressed. All of these factors would affect her bullet's flight path in measurable ways. Her breathing slowed automatically, falling into the rhythm that had been drilled into her during countless training sessions. The crosshairs settled on the target as she made minute adjustments to account for the environmental conditions. The math came naturally now. Calculations that had once required conscious thought now processed automatically. The crowd grew quiet as they sensed the change in atmosphere. Even Marcus stopped talking, watching with growing unease as Sarah demonstrated a level of professional competence that none of them had expected. Sarah's finger found the trigger, applying pressure with the same steady control that had made her legendary among her military peers. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the range, and the bullet began its journey toward the distant target. The bullet struck the target with a metallic ping that carried clearly across the 800 yards. Through the spotting scope, Joe whistled low under his breath. Dead center. Perfect bullseye. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at the distant target through his binoculars, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something approaching respect. That's impossible. Nobody hits dead center on their first try at that distance. Sarah calmly worked the bolt of her rifle, ejecting the spent cartridge. The familiar motion was as natural as breathing, performed thousands of times in training and combat. She looked up at Marcus with the same calm expression she had worn all afternoon. I believe you owe me an apology. Dale grabbed his own spotting scope, desperately seeking some explanation for what he had just witnessed. Maybe it was a lucky shot. Wind could have shifted at just the right moment. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. Ray was shaking his head in amazement. I've been shooting here for 8 years, and I've never seen anyone nail the center ring like that on their first attempt. Hell, I'm not sure I've ever done it myself. Joe walked over to Sarah, his weathered face showing genuine respect. Miss, I don't know where you learned to shoot like that, but that was some of the finest marksmanship I've ever witnessed. In 40 years of running this range, I can count on one hand the number of people who could make that shot. Marcus still seemed unable to process what had happened. His entire worldview about women and shooting had just been shattered by a petite brunette in jeans and a t-shirt. Where did you learn to shoot like that? Sarah stood up, slinging her rifle across her shoulder with practiced ease. I told you, I picked up a few things here and there. She wasn't ready to share the full truth about her military service. Some people weren't ready to hear that a woman had been one of the most effective snipers in recent military history. The crowd was buzzing with excitement now. Several experienced shooters approached Sarah, eager to discuss technique and equipment. An older woman who had been watching from the sidelines stepped forward with obvious pride. Honey, that was absolutely incredible. These boys needed to be taken down a peg or two. Kevin was studying Sarah's rifle with new eyes. This isn't just custom work, is it? This is military-grade equipment, professional-level modifications. He looked up at Sarah with dawning understanding. You're military, aren't you? Sarah neither confirmed nor denied the observation. I served, she said simply. Marcus finally seemed to find his voice again. Served where? Doing what? The question hung in the air as Sarah considered how much to reveal. Her military record was classified at the highest levels, her missions conducted in places that officially didn't exist. She had spent 3 years as a designated marksman with the 75th Ranger Regiment, followed by 2 years with an elite special operations unit whose very existence was compartmented information. Afghanistan, she said finally. 2 tours. Joe nodded with the understanding that only came from shared military experience. Infantry? Special operations, Sarah replied, offering the minimum detail necessary to satisfy curiosity without revealing operational specifics. The admission sent ripples through the gathered crowd. Suddenly, her exceptional marksmanship made perfect sense. This wasn't some amateur who had gotten lucky. This was a trained professional with combat experience. Dale was looking embarrassed now, his earlier condescension replaced by genuine respect. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We had no idea about your background. That was incredibly ignorant of us to assume. Sarah waved off the apology. No harm done. You weren't the first, and you probably won't be the last. Marcus was struggling with conflicting emotions. His masculine pride had taken a severe blow, but he was also witnessing a level of skill that demanded respect. So, about that competition next weekend? Are you still interested? A small smile played at the corners of Sarah's mouth. Absolutely. Ray was examining the target through high-powered binoculars. This is unreal. The shot isn't just in the center ring, it's perfectly centered, like it was placed there with tweezers. The news of Sarah's incredible shot was spreading throughout the range. Other shooters were abandoning their own practice sessions to hear about the woman who had just achieved what many considered nearly impossible. The story was already growing in the telling, with each retelling adding new details and embellishments. Sarah began packing up her equipment, ready to leave while she was ahead. The rifle went back into its case with the same careful precision she had shown in everything else. Each component had its specific place, secured against movement during transport. "Wait," called out Marcus, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "You can't just leave like that. We need to understand how you made that shot. The wind reading, the elevation adjustment, the lead time." Sarah paused in her packing. "There's no mystery to it. You read the conditions, make the calculations, and execute the shot. Same as anything else." But Marcus wasn't satisfied with that explanation. "Nobody is that good without serious training. I've spent thousands of dollars on instruction, practiced for years, and I still can't shoot like that consistently." "Maybe you've been learning from the wrong instructors," Sarah suggested diplomatically. Joe approached with a business proposal. "Miss, I don't suppose you'd be interested in giving some lessons here at the range. We have a lot of folks who could benefit from professional instruction, and after seeing that shot, I think you'd have more students than you could handle." Sarah considered the offer. Since leaving the military, she had been struggling to find meaningful work that utilized her unique skills. Civilian employers didn't quite know what to do with someone whose military occupational specialty was essentially professional elimination of enemy targets at extreme range. "I might be interested," she said carefully, "depending on the arrangement." Marcus jumped at the opportunity. "I'd pay whatever you're asking for private lessons. That level of marksmanship is exactly what I've been trying to achieve." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The same man who had mocked her abilities an hour ago was now begging for instruction. Military service had taught her about the fragility of male egos, but civilian life was providing fresh examples daily. "We can discuss it after the competition next weekend," Sarah said, "if you're still interested after I take your money." The comment drew laughs from the crowd, but Marcus nodded eagerly. His earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by genuine enthusiasm to learn from someone with her obvious expertise. Dale was shaking his head in amazement. "I still can't believe what I just witnessed. That shot was textbook perfect." "Better than textbook perfect, actually." Sarah finished packing her equipment and stood to leave. The crowd was still buzzing with excitement, already turning her single shot into range legend. By tomorrow, the story would have grown to include multiple impossible shots and dramatic wind conditions. "One question before you go," called out Ray. "How many confirmed? In Afghanistan? Did you see much action?" The question touched on areas that Sarah preferred not to discuss with civilians. Her military service had included missions that she couldn't talk about and wouldn't want to even if she could. The reality of combat sniping was far different from the romanticized version that Hollywood presented. "Enough," she said simply. Joe walked with her toward the parking lot. "You know, I meant what I said about teaching here. This place could use someone with your credentials. Too many weekend warriors teaching bad habits to new shooters." Sarah appreciated the offer, but she wasn't sure she was ready to make her military skills into a public commodity. Some aspects of her training were too specialized, too lethal for civilian application. Teaching marksmanship fundamentals was one thing. Teaching the advanced techniques of military sniping was something else entirely. "I'll think about it," she promised. As Sarah reached her pickup truck, Marcus jogged up behind her. His earlier swagger was completely gone, replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. "One last question if you don't mind. That rifle, how many missions did you carry it on?" Sarah looked back at the weapon case in her truck bed. The rifle inside had been her constant companion through some of the most dangerous assignments in modern warfare. It had saved her life more times than she could count, and had been instrumental in completing missions that helped bring her teammates home safely. "Enough missions to know it like a part of myself," she said. Marcus nodded with something approaching awe. "Ma'am, it's been an honor to witness your shooting today. I hope you'll accept my sincere apology for the way we treated you initially." Sarah climbed into her truck, rolling down the window. "Apology accepted. See you next weekend, Marcus. Bring your checkbook." As she drove away from the range, Sarah reflected on the afternoon's events. The civilian world continued to surprise her with its assumptions and prejudices, but it also offered opportunities to prove that appearance could be profoundly deceiving. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her younger sister. "How was the shooting practice? Did you remember to take it easy on the civilians?" Sarah smiled as she typed back, "I remembered to take it easy. They didn't." The drive home gave her time to think about Joe's offer to teach at the range. Part of her missed the precision and purpose of her military role. But another part was still adjusting to a world where her particular skills weren't needed for survival. Teaching might offer a way to bridge those two worlds. Next weekend's competition would be interesting. Word would spread about today's demonstration, and she suspected the field of competitors would be much more serious than Marcus and his weekend warrior friends. Real precision shooters would want to test themselves against someone with her proven abilities. Sarah pulled into her driveway as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the suburban neighborhood. Her house was modest and unremarkable, giving no hint that it was home to someone who had been one of the military's most lethal assets. The neighbors probably thought she was a teacher or office worker, something safe and predictable. Tomorrow she would clean her rifle, review the ballistic data from today's shot, and begin preparing for the weekend competition. But tonight, she was content to enjoy the memory of Marcus's shocked expression when her bullet found its mark with surgical precision. Saturday morning arrived with perfect shooting conditions. The wind was calm, temperature steady at 78 degrees, and visibility unlimited under clear Texas skies. Sarah arrived at the Riverside shooting range an hour before the competition was scheduled to begin, wanting to verify her rifle's zero and observe the other competitors. The parking lot was significantly busier than the previous weekend. Word of her incredible shot had spread through the local shooting community, and the competition had drawn entries from across 3 counties. Sarah counted at least 40 vehicles, many bearing out-of-state license plates and expensive rifle cases. Joe greeted her at the registration table with obvious enthusiasm. "Sarah, glad you decided to show up. We've got 68 entries for today's competition, including several state champions and at least 3 former military snipers who heard about last weekend." Sarah raised an eyebrow at this information. "Former military?" "Word gets around fast in the shooting community," Joe explained. "When someone makes a perfect center shot at 800 yards on their first try, people take notice. We've got some serious competition today." She paid her entry fee and received her competitor number, 47. The competition would proceed in waves, with shooters divided into groups of 10. Scores would be cumulative across 3 distances, 300, 500, and 800 yards, with 10 shots at each distance. As Sarah walked toward the preparation area, she noticed several competitors studying her with obvious interest. Most were middle-aged men with expensive equipment, but she also spotted 2 women and several younger shooters who looked like they meant serious business. Marcus approached with a nervous smile, carrying a rifle case that looked brand new. "Sarah, I'm so glad you came. I've been practicing every day since last weekend, working on my breathing technique and trigger control." "Good," Sarah replied simply. She appreciated his newfound humility, but the competition would reveal whether his practice had translated into improved performance. A tall man with graying temples and military bearing walked over to introduce himself. "Ma'am, I'm Colonel David Reeves, retired Army. I heard about your demonstration last weekend and wanted to introduce myself. Ranger Sniper School, class of '92. Sarah studied his face, recognizing the quiet confidence that marked genuine special operations personnel. "Sarah Martinez, pleased to meet you, sir." Reeves nodded approvingly. The precision of that shot has people talking all the way to Fort Benning. Mind if I ask what unit you served with? 75th Rangers, then SOF, Sarah replied, using the generic term for Special Operations Forces that avoided revealing specific unit details. Ah, Reeves said with understanding. The kind of work that doesn't make the newspapers. Before Sarah could respond, the range officer called for the first wave of competitors. She was assigned to the third wave, giving her time to observe the early shooters and gauge the overall skill level. The first competitor was a young man from Houston who shot respectably, but nothing exceptional. His 300-yard group measured approximately 4 inches, solid but unspectacular. The second shooter, an older woman from Dallas, demonstrated excellent technique and managed a 2-inch group that drew appreciative comments from observers. When Colonel Reeves took his position for the first string, Sarah paid careful attention. His shooting position was textbook perfect, and his shots were delivered with mechanical precision. His 300-yard group measured just over 1 inch, demonstrating the kind of consistency that only came from extensive training and natural ability. "Now that's what professional shooting looks like," commented a spectator standing nearby. Sarah continued to observe as wave after wave of shooters attempted the 3 distances. The competition was definitely more serious than she had expected. Several shooters managed sub-inch groups at 300 yards, and most were clearly experienced precision shooters rather than weekend hobbyists. Marcus was in the second wave, and Sarah watched his performance with interest. His practice had obviously helped. His 300-yard group was significantly better than anything she would have expected based on his previous boasting. Still, it measured nearly 3 inches, respectable but not competitive at this level. When Sarah's wave was called, she approached the firing line with the same calm professionalism she had demonstrated the previous weekend. The rifle felt familiar and comfortable in her hands, its weight and balance as known to her as her own heartbeat. The 300-yard string was almost insultingly easy for someone with her background. At that distance, environmental factors were minimal, and the only real challenge was maintaining consistent shooting fundamentals. Sarah's 10 shots formed a group that could be covered by a quarter, all within the highest scoring ring. "Holy hell," whispered one of the spotters. "That's the tightest group I've seen all day." The 500-yard distance required more careful attention to wind conditions and bullet drop. Sarah made minute adjustments to her scope elevation and studied the mirage patterns through her optics. The shots were delivered with the same methodical precision, each one called before the trigger was pressed. Her 500-yard group drew gasps from the assembled crowd. 10 shots in a pattern smaller than most shooters could achieve at half that distance. Colonel Reeves was watching from the sidelines, his expression one of professional appreciation. "Outstanding shooting," he called out. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." The 800-yard distance was where the competition would truly be decided. At that range, even small errors in reading wind conditions or calculating ballistic data would result in missed targets. Sarah had watched several excellent shooters struggle at this distance, including 2 who had performed flawlessly at the shorter ranges. Sarah settled into position behind her rifle, feeling the familiar sensation of the world narrowing to just herself and the distant target. The wind had picked up slightly since morning, now running about 5 miles per hour from the southwest. Temperature had risen to 82 degrees, and the humidity was climbing towards 60%. Through her scope, the 800-yard target seemed impossibly small. The scoring rings were barely visible even with high magnification, and the slightest error in aim point would result in a poor score. This was where her military training provided an overwhelming advantage. The first shot broke cleanly, and Sarah could see through her scope that it had struck the center ring. The second followed with mechanical precision. By the 5th shot, the crowd had grown completely silent, watching a demonstration of marksmanship that most had never witnessed. When Sarah's 10 shots were complete, the range officer walked downrange to score the target. His voice carried clearly across the range as he called out the results. "Perfect score! 10 shots, all in the center ring." The silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause from competitors and spectators. Several shooters approached to examine Sarah's rifle and discuss her technique, but she remained characteristically modest about the achievement. Colonel Reeves was the first to reach her. "Ma'am, That was absolutely extraordinary. I've shot competitively for 30 years, including matches at Camp Perry, and I've never seen anything quite like that 800-yard string. Marcus appeared at Sarah's shoulder, his face showing a mixture of awe and defeat. Sarah, I don't even know what to say. That was inhuman. How is that level of precision even possible? Sarah was disassembling her rifle, returning each component to its designated place in her case. It's not magic, she said quietly. Just training and practice. But her answer didn't satisfy the growing crowd of admirers. Word of her perfect score was spreading rapidly through the range, and shooters were abandoning their own preparations to witness the rest of her performance. Joe approached with the scoring sheets, his face showing obvious excitement. Sarah, your cumulative score is mathematically impossible to beat. Even if everyone else shoots perfect scores on their remaining strings, you've already won. The reality was actually more dramatic than Joe indicated. Sarah's performance was so far ahead of the competition that she had essentially lapped the field. Her margins of victory at each distance were larger than most competitors' total group sizes. As the final waves of shooters completed their strings, it became clear that Sarah's victory was not just decisive, but historic. Her combined score was the highest ever recorded at the Riverside shooting range, and several competitors suggested it might be a state record. The award ceremony was held in the range's small clubhouse, with Sarah standing somewhat uncomfortably at the center of attention. The first-place trophy was larger than she had expected, and the prize money envelope contained significantly more than the advertised amount due to side bets and impromptu donations from impressed spectators. Colonel Reeves approached during the reception that followed. Sarah, I represent a group that organizes precision shooting competitions across the Southwest. We'd be honored to have you participate in our regional championships next month. Before Sarah could respond, Marcus interrupted with his own offer. Sarah, I meant what I said about private lessons. Name your price. After watching your performance today, I realize I don't know the first thing about precision shooting. Joe was equally enthusiastic. The offer to teach here at the range still stands. After today's demonstration, you'd have more students than you could handle. Sarah accepted congratulations graciously, but remained non-committal about future plans. The attention was flattering, but also somewhat overwhelming for someone accustomed to operating in shadows and maintaining low profiles. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts and her trophy. The competition had been a satisfying challenge, but it had also highlighted how different her skills were from typical civilian shooting. She had been holding back significantly, using perhaps 20% of her true capabilities. The drive home gave her time to process the day's events and consider the various offers she had received. Teaching at the local range might provide income and purpose, but it would also mean revealing more about her background than she was entirely comfortable with. Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. The caller ID showed her former team leader from Afghanistan. Martinez, I just heard through the grapevine that you're making waves in the civilian shooting world. Sarah smiled, remembering the easy camaraderie of military service. Just staying sharp, Sergeant Major. Well, keep it up. The community needs to see what real professionals can do. And Martinez? Don't let them forget that some of the best shooters in the world happen to be women. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her truck for several minutes, trophy in her lap. The day had been about more than winning a shooting competition. It had been about proving that assumptions based on appearance could be dangerously wrong, and that underestimating people was often a costly mistake. Monday morning, she would call Joe about teaching opportunities at the range. It was time to share her knowledge with people who could appreciate it, and perhaps inspire other women to pursue precision shooting despite the skepticism they might encounter. The trophy would go on her mantle, not as a symbol of victory over others, but as a reminder that true expertise spoke for itself, regardless of who possessed it. Marcus and his friends had learned that lesson the hard way, but they had learned it with grace and humility that suggested their ridicule had been born of ignorance rather than malice. Sarah Martinez had found her place in the civilian world, one perfect shot at a time.